Thank you, thank you. It's good to be back home. I love being here, and super excited to be with Travis. It's a space I'm slightly obsessed about. Anyone who kind of follows me on Twitter will probably have noticed, and anyone who doesn't follow me on Twitter, what are you guys waiting for? I mean, that's the way to start. So, I love the space, and actually, Travis is the main culprit for my love and obsession for the space, because we invested in the company more than a year and a half ago when you guys just started in Santa Monica, and the thing with what they do is that when you start thinking about the space that's allocated to cars in city, you can't, stop unseeing it. And, then you start thinking, how come we are using 2 tons of metal to move our 60, 70, 80 kilos of bodies, while something that weighs 16 kilos like an e-scooter can do the job just as well? And why are we giving away so much space to the cities? And when you start thinking about it, then you have to become obsessed, because more than half of the space in any city is dedicated to cars. And it just makes absolutely no sense. And so, Travis, as Vlad mentioned, he's a bit of a legend in the micromobility scene, because he's the one who actually came up with the whole concept.
Well, we couldn't have done it without the Index folks. They actually, when they invested and we first met, Bird was still operating out of a WeWork in Santa Monica, in Los Angeles, and we were still pretty small. I remember we were giving the presentation to Index in the WeWork conference room with the glass, and people were kind of peeking in because you had a lot of the partners there. But it's been exciting to partner with you guys.
Yeah, that was all rehearsed, obviously, as you can tell. So look, super excited to be here, and first question for Travis is really, what brings you to Paris? I think there are some big news.
Yeah, so in Paris, love the city of Paris. So first off, I'm happy to come here any time. We do have a pretty big team here already, so out here meeting with the team. But we do have an exciting announcement that I think just hit this morning, that we're setting up a European headquarters here in Paris. We already have 100 employees here, operational and management and communications and a bunch of different functions. But we want to continue to expand that, and we're committing to 1,000 employees over the next 2 years to really invest even heavier into the city of Paris. We think it's a great city for micromobility and for Bird, and so we're excited to be here.
So first, wow! 1,000 people in Paris. It's a pretty massive commitment. What makes Paris such a good city? How come you go in a room and you get, 75% of people who have already used an e-scooter?
Yeah, well, look, I think Paris is a great city for e-scooters in particular and micromobility, because obviously it's a lot of people. It's a very dense area, Paris there's only so many roads. As you know, there's a big traffic problem in the city. There's a lot of cars that we're trying to jam into, city infrastructure that have been built, 100 plus years ago. And so there's, it's not just Paris though. We're seeing cities across the world are really starting to break. There's not enough road space to keep pumping more and more cars in. And so for us, I grew up, my mother was a public bus driver for 30 years. And so I grew up in witnessing kind of public transportation, and ended up in ride sharing. In my time in ride sharing, realized we were using 2-ton, vehicles to really move people around very short distances. And ride sharing had a positive impact, I think, on things like reducing drinking and driving and some parking challenges in cities. But in a lot of cases, we were making traffic worse and carbon emissions actually worse in cities. And it didn't seem to make sense that we would use a massive 2-ton, car to really move people these short distances, and felt like there had to be a better way. We think, short range electric vehicles, in particular electric scooters, are a great solution for that. But our true north as a company is any solution that helps get people out of cars, and so we're excited about that.
Can you give us a sense for the size of the operation in Paris, so we know how many employees in terms of how many users and riders, and how long has the business been going here?
So we've been operating almost a year now in Paris. It had been one of our biggest cities globally. We have recently pulled back our fleet to around 4,000 vehicles in Paris, because we are working closely with the city on figuring out where are the right areas to park. How do we do this in an orderly fashion? We're doing this, it's not unique to Paris, but we are working with cities across the world because what we're finding is cities really want to help get people out of cars, but they also, the infrastructure just isn't there yet on the parking side in particular, and in a lot of cases the bike lane side. And so we want to work with cities through this transition. Anytime you do a big transition in transportation, it can be a little rocky and it takes a little time, but we think ultimately it's a great transition for the world to try to get out of cars. Sometimes we talk about how over 100 years ago people used to get around on horseback. And then when cars came around, people were like, wow, these cars are crazy. There's no place for them to park. There's no place for them to go, and they're running horses off the road. And it was actually a very long transition from horseback to cars. It was about 20 years that it took to make that transition. Thankfully, I think the transition to micromobility and alternatives to cars will hopefully be faster than that. But clearly we need to all work together as a society and with cities to figure out what is the most graceful way to make that transition, because the city infrastructure just really wasn't built for electric scooters.
That was kind of my introduction point around what I love about what you do is it asks questions of things that we all took for granted. We never ask ourselves, how was the city before there were cars? How did we build all of the infrastructure? I mean, we were born, all of us, I think we're all young enough to were born and raised in a city that was already like this, with all of the space for cars. And what you guys are creating is this question, how, could it be different, and why is it that way? So I think that's quite profound as an impact. So you mentioned, there has been some rocky, obviously, the transition is not easy because cars are there and they are well encroached on the public space. And people have been complaining about, a lot of it is around, parking and speeding, kind of safety. So how are you solving, and I have to say, I've had some pretty heated conversation, even at some family reunions where you have, the scooter fans, again, the scooter haters a little bit. So how do you navigate, and how can you make scooters just part of a normal life the same way, cars and bicycles and pedestrians are? How do you organize a city to make everything work together?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that's why we are trying to work with the cities to figure out how do we have dedicated parking throughout cities. Outside of Paris, we're working with a bunch of cities to actually give one parking space from a car every city block in the downtown area, and make that into parking for micromobility. And what we're finding is local businesses love that because you can fit 10 to 15 scooters in the same space that you can fit one car, which means it's a lot more leverage on that public space, and you can have more people come and go. And so as a local business, that's the most important thing. And so we're really finding strong allies with local businesses that want more and more customers coming in. And we think, in cities around the world, it would be super interesting if one parking spot on every block was taken from cars, given to micromobility. We think that's a super interesting solution. In Paris, of course, they've already said, we should park in the moped parking space or the other scooter parking space. And so we now on the map have over 4,000 dedicated parking areas in Paris. And
they're also making ways from car parking, right? And it's on the road, on the curb, right?
This week they started spray painting some dedicated micromobility parking throughout the city. So I think these are all great steps towards how do we make a transition away from cars, and we're seeing cities really around the world embrace that. But clearly we all need to work together to figure out, what's the most graceful way to do that, and that's why in the short term we've pulled back our fleet a little bit in Paris.
I think one thing but related to the government relation that's very interesting at your company is that clearly governments and local authorities are a key stakeholder for your business, and so internally you also organize that way. So I think you have a product team focused on building tools for the local authorities. Can you tell us a bit about how you organize internally to work best with government, and what kind of tools are you building for them?
Yeah, so we have a pretty big team internally at Bird called the GovTech team, and they're constantly building new technologies that are really designed for cities. I always say if you start a transportation company, two things need to be true. Number one, cities need to be your number one customer, and two, safety needs to be your number one priority. And so for us, on the city number one customer, the GovTech team is constantly building different solutions to try to solve some of these problems. So For example, the dedicated parking in Paris, we were able to, the GovTech team was able to react very quickly and roll out that dedicated parking. Now when you take, at the end of your ride, you take a picture, and we actually have a team of people, but also we're using some other machine learning things and vision recognition things just to identify how is the parking good or not. Some things like sidewalk riding detection. It turns out, it sounds easy maybe if you're not in the tech world. I know most of you probably understand technology, and it's using GPS to determine if somebody's riding on a sidewalk is basically impossible, especially in urban environments. And so we're working on all sorts of other technology to try to help detect if people are on sidewalks. And so there's a bunch of exciting things that we're working on for GovTech.
And on the hardware side, so what are we going to see next on the street? So you announced this pretty cool kind of two-seaters electric. I mean, I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, have you come up with a new word for that type of vehicle? What's
we just call it the Bird Cruiser.
The Cruiser, okay.
So it's a cruiser.
Is that coming to Paris? Is that coming to Europe? Or?
Well, we haven't announced in Paris yet, but we would be open to that. I think it's a matter of, does it make sense? Does the city think it makes sense given the other modes of modality that they have? But the Cruiser we think is exciting because it's a combination of an e-bike and an e-moped, really in one. And so it's lighter weight than a moped, but you can fit two people on it safely, and we think it's a very exciting vehicle. The response so far has been very strong, and we're going to be rolling that out in the U.S. This summer, and then hopefully Europe to follow. But I do think the vehicle, we have about 100 vehicle engineers that come from companies like Tesla and Faraday, and the vehicle engineering is a critical piece in this business, and so we continue to iterate fast on the hardware. We started with Bird Zero, which we rolled out last fall, and now we're rolling out Bird One, as you know, throughout the world as well.
Which we've tried yesterday. It's a pretty sweet ride.
Yeah, I think you were one of the first in Paris to ride the Bird One.
It is beautiful. I mean, it's gonna be exciting. Yeah. And are they now lasting long enough? I mean, obviously there's been a lot of these rumors going around that these scooters last for months and it's not environmentally friendly and it's all going to waste. Yeah. What's your response to that? Yeah,
so we were the first in the world to do the electric scooter sharing, and the problem with being the first was it turned out nobody in China was building ruggedized electric scooters. And so there wasn't really hardware off the shelf we could use. So what does
ruggedized mean?
Well, so for us, ruggedized is, and I'm not sure if that's a word that translates well, but the early scooters that they were built for really an ownership use case. They were built to be ridden like once a day by a person that owns it and doesn't leave it outside. And so what we saw is the early scooters, and we knew this would be the case because we just bought them on Alibaba.com and just shipped them into LA because we didn't know if people would even ride them at the time, and so it's kind of still a test. But the batteries were incredibly small, and the vehicles would break down a lot, which of course is pretty expensive. And so the early scooters, it's definitely true, only lasted 2-3 months, but it wasn't a surprise to us. So in parallel, we were building out a pretty big vehicle engineering team to work on the future hardware that was really designed for this use case. And now we're excited that Bird Zero on average is lasting over 12 months. So we went from a scooter that's lasting 2 to 3 months to a scooter lasting over 12 months, and it's fundamentally changed the game on the economics of the business. And we keep hearing it's a more enjoyable ride and a safer ride as well.
Yeah, and is the hardware the main differentiation with the competition? I mean, obviously there's a handful of them today, in Paris being one of the most competitive cities. Is the hardware the main part of differentiation with this?
Yeah, I think it is, and it might not be noticeable yet, but there's I think over the course of the next 6 to 12 months, people are really going to start to see a big delta in the hardware that's out there, and we've certainly invested heavily. In fact, in addition to rolling out Bird 1, now we have Bird 2 already that we're riding around the R&D center, and we're targeting Q4 for Bird 2. So we're looking at very fast iteration on the hardware, and I think that will be a big competitive advantage for Bird.
And And do you think that that pace of development is going to slow down eventually, and you'll get to maturity, or do you see that race to better, bigger battery and better hardware, continuing for the next 5 years, 10 years?
Yes. So I always compare the this space to really the cell phone space, and so I joined the cell phone world. I was working on mobile app stores back in 2002. And that was about 5 years before the iPhone, and the hardware on the cell phones just from back then it was the small flip phones, and it was even before the Motorola Razr, and then you saw like incredible innovation on the cell phone side, and I think you're going to see that in the micromobility side, where there continues to be very fast iteration, but I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon.
Did you, when you got started, did you imagine that there would be that level of competition, investment in the space, kind of race to scale? I mean, did you have that planned already from the get-go, or have you been a bit surprised by that?
Yes, so we thought there would be competition. So for the first really 6 to 9 months of the company, we tried to do no press and really stay off the radar as much as possible, but it has been one of the things that surprised me the most is just the level of folks that have tried to do this at scale. And I think I think the good news is there's a lot of folks interested in helping get people out of cars, and ultimately at Bird we continue to think our biggest competitor is cars. So if you look at a city like Paris, there's 500,000 to 1 million cars on the road. I think in the region, I've heard estimates as high as 5 million cars. And so if us and the other micromobility players only have 20,000, 25,000 scooters, clearly those other micromobility companies are not the competitors. It's actually cars that are the competitors, and we think having fewer cars on the road is ultimately good for everybody.
And do you see Bird platform? And do you want to talk a bit about Bird platform and how that's helping you as well in kind of extend your reach and differentiate?
Yeah, so we're as we mentioned, the mission of the company is to try to get people out of cars, not just in the U.S. and Europe, but really globally. But we also recognize as a company we don't have the resources to really roll out Bird everywhere in the world, and so we built Bird platform, which is the ability for local entrepreneurs around the globe to purchase the Bird vehicles, which we think are way far ahead of anything else you can buy in China, and we sell them at cost to the entrepreneur, and then we give them the whole tech stack. It's almost like a SaaS application, software as a service, and then they operate in their local market. And so we've signed dozens of deals now globally of entrepreneurs that want to take Bird into their local region, from Latin America to New Zealand to even in Canada. We do have some folks in Europe that have been starting to do it as well. So we think it's exciting.
In Marseille, right? Which is operating on that model.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
if anyone wants to start a number 13 scooter companies in Paris, then you know where to ask.
But I do think, and one of the reasons we've been able to sign so many people globally is they've recognized that the scooter hardware really matters in this space, and the technology really does matter. And I think we have a lot of Bird now makes, actually from an economic standpoint, makes money on every ride, which is important for us because we can continue to scale into the future and be around for decades to come. But we have seen that some of the smaller scooter companies lose up to $20 per ride, and so if you don't have the right technology and the right hardware, you can lose an incredible amount of money in this industry, and I think that's potentially why we've seen some of the players in Paris start to pull out.
Yeah, what's fascinating is the speed at which that whole market is shaping up. I mean, 3 months ago, it was Paris was in crisis mode, 12, 13 operators, scooters everywhere. And then, fast forward 3 months later, there are only, 5 or 6 left, really. And you really only see probably, 3 or 4 in the street. And everything has been, kind of cleaned up. I mean, do you think in the long run, this is 2, 3 operator market globally, or is it going to be, market by market? You're going to have different combinations. What is the end game in terms of the market dynamics?
Yeah. I do think, like most industries, it will merge down to 2 or 3 major players. We saw that in the ride-hailing space. When I first got into ride-hailing, there was a lot of competitors and copycats, but in the U.S. it merged down to 2 players very quickly, and in most regions around the world, it tended to merge down to 2 or 3 players. And that, by the way, is in ride-hailing, there actually was really not a global advantage there's no economies of scale, in particular on the supply side. Whereas in micromobility, because this is a hardware-driven business, as we're a global company and we're doing more and more vehicles and more rides, the cost of our vehicles keep coming down, and so it actually becomes very difficult for a small regional player to compete with us because of that hardware scale advantage. Yeah,
you always say that, in ride-hailing, where your experience is from, any new cohort of drivers is harder to acquire and of worse quality. Yeah. So actually, there's this economy of scale, so to speak. While with you guys, it's the other way around.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was one of our insights with Bird is, so I ran worldwide driver side at Uber, and my mother was a bus driver for 30 years, as I mentioned. My sister's still a bus driver today, and so I love working with the drivers. But what I will say is, it got more and more difficult in a city to find more drivers, and it got more expensive over time to find those drivers. And the great thing about the hardware-driven business is, the cost of our hardware gets lower over time while the vehicle itself is actually getting better. And so I think it's a key difference with micromobility relative to the ride-hailing space.
And the other thing you mentioned that I thought was quite interesting around the kind of pricing dynamics, the fact that as opposed to ride-hailing, people have to go to the scooters, and so they may be a little bit less price sensitive, and because they have to make an effort to go pick a scooter a bit further out. I mean, can you explain that phenomenon, which I think was quite counterintuitive?
Well, so I know we have a lot of entrepreneurs here, and a lot of folks probably thinking about fundraising, or they are fundraising. And one of the things investors always worry about, I know Index and others think about, is this industry a race to the bottom on pricing? As competitors come online, do the prices keep getting driven down? And I think in ride-hailing, that is what we saw, is because people would sit on the couch and they would just say, okay, whichever service is cheaper, even if it's 2 minutes further away, I'll just wait for it. In the case of micromobility and e-scooters, most people were finding just want the closest scooter when they walk out of a cafe or they walk out of a building, and so we're seeing that people are less maybe price sensitive to it. But the other point is the price is so low already because you don't have to, you're not paying the driver, so the price is incredibly low, and most people think it's very affordable relative to taking an Uber or even owning a car.
And as you said, I think with scale, prices should theoretically, you could afford to bring them down once the battery lasts twice longer and the hardware lasts twice longer. I mean, then you get more room in the long run.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you bring up the batteries. It's the battery capacity keeps getting bigger and bigger. So Bird Zero had 2 times the battery capacity of the original vehicles, which means the economics keep getting better, and the future vehicles we're working on have another 2x improvement on batteries, even over Bird Zero.
And going back to the foundational moment of the business, I mean, you come from bus driver family, you work for ride-hailing, and you live in LA, which is not necessarily seen as the most kind of cycling friendly or kind of micromobility city in the world. It is very much a car dominated. How do you come up with the idea of, okay, instead of using big and also cars are getting bigger and heavier and bulkier, so the trends seem to be going all the way to bigger vehicles for smaller, bigger people as well, actually. But how? And you decide, okay, no, screw that. We'll go for like basically a kid, toy scooter, and to get these people moving around instead. Where did that insight come from?
Well, it was really a few things. We talked about my time in ride-hailing. We were using the 2-ton vehicles to move people around incredibly short distances. I mean, it's really 2-3 mile trips, and then airport trips are primarily what the trips are. And so it seemed very obvious to me, at least, that we needed to come up with a smaller vehicle to help move people around those short distance trips. one of the reasons I got excited about e-scooters was, I bought 1 year for Christmas. I think it was probably Christmas of 2016, roughly. Bought my daughters. I have two daughters, 5 and 8, and I bought them bikes for Christmas, and they were so excited. And I took them outside and was teaching them how to ride the bikes, without the training wheels, and they were very excited about the bikes. But then the next day they woke up and they're like, "Daddy, can we just ride our scooters again today?" And so, anybody who has kids, I think, knows that kids today love riding scooters, and we felt like adults would love it as well if you made it bigger and had an electric motor, which would allow them to get around the cities very easily.
And how did you find that vehicle? I mean, were you selling them, and what was how did you bump into this Xiaomi, the first electric? Because that wasn't really a thing, right? I mean, it was.
Yeah. So at the time, I was already had left Uber and was taking time off to spend time with the kids and the family. And when the kids would go to school, I would find myself, in my office just kind of searching Alibaba for different electric vehicle types. And I started just importing and purchasing different samples of everything from electric skateboards to, hoverboards to one wheels to electric bikes. And finally purchased an electric scooter, and when I rode that, just really loved riding it. It was super easy to do and very enjoyable. It actually made you feel free when you rode it. And so my wife and I would take the early scooters prototypes down the boardwalk, and we would go to college campuses and just ride them around. And always people would stop us and say, "Hey, that's super cool. Can I ride that?" Or "Where did you get that? Can I buy one?" And so it was pretty clear early on that the electric scooter felt like a winner. So we wanted to really double down on that and give it a try.
And then so you combine that vehicle with the kind of free-floating bike sharing model of just putting a QR code on it and unlocking it that way. So you're leveraging smartphones basically too.
Yeah, yeah. I personally don't. In the U.S., we call it dockless. Here, it's free-floating. To me, I've never really loved the term because the reality is cars are free-floating, right, and dockless, and we have dockless cars everywhere and free-floating cars everywhere. Just about every vehicle is free-floating. And so I think it's just a matter of finding dedicated parking, but the concept of free-floating, I think is kind of one of these things that people just forget that cars are already free-floating. Yeah. We do lock the scooters in some markets. We're actually open to that as well, if the city requires it or thinks it makes sense. But what we find is most cities don't have the bike infrastructure, the bike locking infrastructure to actually allow us to lock the scooters up.
Yeah. What's your, fast forward kind of 10 years, what's your ambition for the business? I mean, you see yourself being acquired by one of the ride-hailing guys? Do you see yourself as an independent company? Where do you want to go with Bird?
Yeah, we definitely want to stay independent. We're having a lot of fun, and we think this is a massive opportunity, and we're just scratching the surface with the impact we think we can have on moving people out of cars in cities really around the world. And so it's one of these businesses that it's super fun business to operate. But it also, we think, is having a very positive impact on the world, and so it's really rare to, I think, find a business like that, and so we're excited to stay independent. Correct. Plus, I worked long enough in the ride-hailing space.
Any learning from obviously, a lot of learning from your ride-hailing experience, but anything that you decided to do differently this time around? I mean, you've seen Lyft and Uber scale rapidly, sometimes not necessarily in the most efficient way. What are your key takeaways, and how have you decided to do things differently in your organization and the way you've expanded internationally, especially with Bird?
Yeah, so one of the things we're doing differently, I think, is culturally is very important to us early on to only hire employees that were super passionate about helping get people out of cars or just passionate about riding around on the Birds. I think if you're hiring, and we scaled from 1 employee to well over 1,000 in about a year and a half, and so when you scale that quickly from an employee standpoint, you can have culture problems if you're not careful. And so I found the number one way to keep a strong culture is to make sure people are very mission driven and passionate about the service as part of the interview process. So that's kind of internal culture maybe difference. As far as scaling, we do collaborate a lot more with cities than I think we did back in the ride-hailing days, which I think is a big difference.
And so, how do you organize 1,000 people in a year and a half? I mean, that's such a, I don't know how many people in the room have scaled a company from 100 to 1,000, more than 1,000 people in a year and a half. But that's a lot of people. The 10x growth in a year, in 18 months. How do you organize? How do you maintain structure? How do you maintain clear reporting lines? How do people know what to do when they show up the first day at work? How does that work?
Yeah, it has been one of the bigger challenges in the business. I think it's very easy, I think, to run a scooter company in one city, especially if you're willing to lose a lot of money for a ride. The challenge here is really actually scaling a global scooter or micromobility company incredibly fast, while also making money per ride and having strong unit economics, which of course investors care a lot about, but also being able to scale the employee side, which of course, if you don't have great employees, you won't be a great world-class company. And so that's something very, very important to us. And we had the luxury of seeing very fast growth. At Lyft, I was their kind of top 20 employee, and helped scale that company. And then at Uber, we scaled pretty aggressively as well. So we were able to tap into some of the old, kind of talent from the ride-hail days. But it is rare to find managers that have seen that kind of rapid scale. It is a different skill set.
And how do you manage to keep? Obviously, you got a lot of central functions, in terms of product design, hardware, engineering, and some marketing. And obviously, it's a very local business, so you do need some level of autonomy on the ground. But so how do you decide which functions go in Paris versus LA? And what do you centralize? What do you leave to the local guys?
Yeah, it's always a balance between what's local and what's regional, and then what's centralized. The way I think about it is the GM on the ground ultimately kind of makes the decision, because headquarters will build the technology platform and give them, try to give the cities the tools to be successful. But ultimately, the person on the ground has the most insight into, how the operation should work, and they should be able to, hopefully our technology allows them to configure the city properly. But if not, we've hired a great operational team, and they tend to be very creative about how do they quickly react to things on the ground before usually as you can imagine, the tech and the product stuff trails behind what the city needs actually are. Yeah. Especially when you're operating in over 120 cities and over 100 college campuses globally.
Wow. Any final piece of advice for the entrepreneurs in the room who are just getting started or thinking about bringing their ideas to market? Yeah, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is probably, if you're looking to start a company or you have started a company, I would highly recommend you find one that you're super passionate about, because as you know, it's very difficult. It's easy to start a company. It's a whole nother thing to kind of scale it for years and try to make it successful. There's a lot of hard work, and so I'm super passionate about Bird, which makes me excited to get up every morning and continue to work on it. And I think I have started companies in the past where after a few months I was just not very passionate about it, and it is difficult. And so for me, I think that's the number one thing when you're trying to just starting out with trying to figure out what do you want to do. I think just think about what you're passionate about. Right. Thanks, Travis. That was a great session.
Thanks for having me.
Good life on